Welcome to the Beyond 20 Cherwell tutorial series. The Cherwell REST API is designed to give access to Cherwell Service Management Tool from other applications. But did you know this powerful API can be used to enrich the functionality of one-steps in the Cherwell system itself? Let's look at the following use case. The client wishes to have multiple fields from a specifics form added to an email, but only the fields that have been populated and designated for the email should be included. Using the Cherwell REST API web service, a one-step can get the business object for the specifics form as a JSON and walk through the result to see if each field has a value populated and only add those fields that are populated to the email. The first step is to create an API client key in Cherwell for the REST API. The client key is created by selecting Security in the Administrator console and then Edit REST API Client Settings. You click the plus sign to create a new client, give that client a name, and we like to have them match a valid username. For our video, we've used the CSD admin, which is the default admin that comes with Cherwell out of the box. And this will generate a client key. We're going to take that client key and we're going to save it in a blueprint stored value. The reason it's blueprint is we don't want anyone that is not an administrator to have access to that stored value. So we've created several stored values. The one we're going to store our API client key in is called REST API key. Now this will be a non-user specific value because the REST API key will only change if you change it in the administrator console. So that key is always going to stay constant for your web service. We also need the following stored values created in the blueprint folder for the Cherwell REST API web service. The first stored value is going to be a user-specific value, and that will be called REST API login. This will be built as a pre-step to our one-steps that run to access our Cherwell web service. Then we have the REST API login content type. This will always be a static value, so we set that as a non-user specific value, and we give it the value of application/x-www-form-URL encoded. This tells the one-step that we're going to encode our headers before we send them out so that people can't read them. Next, we have a REST API bearer token, and again, its value is user-specific. Our REST API key, which we've already set. Our REST API name, which is the name of the user we want to send. That's going to be static. And our REST API password. I have made sure that this is in the this stored value is stored in the blueprint folder, and then I've encoded the value so that it cannot be read if someone does actually access it. And then later in our one-step, we'll decode the value so that the actual value that we want to send is sent across in the URL encoded header. So just a little bit of added security there. So now we're ready to build out our web service. So the Cherwell REST API has a web service with a URL that will have your server name, and in this case we've set it to localhost, but you'll want to replace that if you're on SaaS with the actual server name for your instance. And of course that will be, you could set that as a stored value if you wanted. And then Cherwell API. The service type is REST. The security is none. Even though we do use OAuth 2 authentication, we cannot set OAuth 2 authentication as a security type. So we set it to none, and we have to do a login method that will allow us to gain access using that API key and the API login that we generate with each one of our one-step calls to the web service. So login is going to be our default method for the Cherwell REST API service. It has 3 parameters. The first parameter is the API key, which is an endpoint. The second parameter is the content type, which we've already said we've stored that as a stored value, and we'll show you that later. And then we have data, and we'll show you how each of those look in our one step. For the purposes of this use case, we also needed 2 API methods. One is the getObjectSchema, and here is where we show you how we authorize each of our methods. So the method carries an authorization bearer token. It also requires 2 endpoint parameters, the business object ID and the API key. The second method we need for this use case is to get the object record. So get business object record. Again, we need our authorization header. We need our API key. We need our business object ID, and we need our business object rec ID. And we'll explain those when we look at the method, the actual one steps. So those are the 3 methods that we're going to use for this use case in the Cherwell REST API. Now we'll take a look at the 2 one steps that we've created to access the Cherwell REST API and gather the information we need for the email. The first one is we need to get the specific schema. So remember, this is being run against a specifics form. So we're going to run it from the incident association. We have a pre-step here. And remember, I told you we have a pre-step because we want to build out part of our login header using an encoded or a decoded password. So we've stored our REST API key and our name and our encoded password. And then what we'll use here is a modifier that will decode the password so that when we send a URL encoded header, we will send the actual encoding of the actual password, not an encoding of an encryption. So we don't need double encryption. The next part of our one step is we have to start off by logging into the Cherwell REST API and getting our bearer token that will allow us to call the different API methods. So we're going to log into Cherwell. We're going to store our result and our return code and our headers with these variable names. And then we're going to make sure we don't want to stop the one step if it's an error, because we've added a fork that says if it's an error, we're going to show you a pop-up that says what the error is. You could also store that error information in a journal if you like. So the method for login, remember we have the content type, and that is that static value of REST API login content type. Our data, which is the REST API login stored value, which we've just created in our pre-steps, and our API key, which is the REST API key stored value. Once we make the call, we're going to decide whether we received a valid or a successful login or not. And if it's successful, the return code is going to be less than 400. It'll usually be 200 or 201, but just for safety's sake, I set it to say less than 400. So if it's less than 400, we'll follow the top branch. If it's 400 or greater, we're going to show you a pop-up that tells you what happened, what went wrong. Our next step after we've logged in is we need to build out our bearer token. So remember, we have a stored value, which was a user-specific value called REST API bearer token. And that is going to be the word bearer, a space, and then from the JSON that was returned, we need to modify that so that we can get the actual access token from the returned JSON of a successful login. So we're going to store that into our REST API bearer token. And now we can run our API method to get the object schema. And you'll notice now we're setting our result and our return code and our headers with different variable names. And again, we do not want to stop the one step on error. Our method of getBusinessObjectSchema again has 3 different parameters we must fill in. Our authorization header is going to use that REST API bearer token that we've just received from or created after we logged in. The business object ID is the specifics type ID, not the specifics type from incident, but the specifics dot type ID. And the API key does not have to be set in this method, so we can leave that blank. After we make our call, again, we look to see if we received a valid code of less than 400. If we did not, we'll show the error message. If we did, we'll run what's on the upper branch. And this is going to clear out a user-specific store value called Spec Schema. It's going to get the JSON array for the field definitions, which is our specific result with a modifier of find array, and the array we're looking for is field definitions. Next, we'll step through the collection of field defs. We'll call each item variable name a field def. And when we step through it, the first thing we'll do is get the category. So we'll just use a variable here because that's going to change on each one. So the variable will be the field cat will be the variable name, and the value will be the field def with a modifier of string from element category. Then we'll check to see if that category is in a list of categories that we like. So what we want to know is, was the field category not empty? And also, is it not like the word system? So if it has system in it, we don't want it. If it's empty, we don't want it. Otherwise, let's put it in our report. So that builds out our spec schema that will be used in our next one step. Next one step is called Get Specific Values. And because tokens are only valid for a limited amount of time, and we can never be too sure how long any specific one step is going to take, I have made sure to add the login and the pre-steps to generate the REST API login header in both one steps. If we knew that first one step was always going to take, or was always going to be limited in amount of time so that we had time to run both one steps on the same token, we would not have to log in twice. But for the sake of safety, decided to go ahead and make sure that we log in twice. So we call our service, we log in. If we're successful, we go ahead, and now that we're successful after logging in, we update the bearer token again so that we can call our specifics get specifics business object. Again, we've set our result and our return code and our headers. And this get a business object record requires four different parameters. So the first one being that authorization with the REST API bearer token. Business object ID, again, that specifics.type ID. The business object rec ID, which is specifics.rec ID. And the API key, which is the REST API key stored value. So we make the call, and we determine whether or not we have an error or a success. If we're successful, we're going to initialize a report variable for the fields, and another variable called report vals for the values. Now you could do this all in one variable if you wanted to, by just putting the report field name, the field name, and then a colon, and then the value. But if you want to have the values or the field names in one column and the values in another column, you're going to need two different variables to do that. Next, we're going to get the array of the field list. So we're going to create a variable called field list. That variable will have the type of a JSON array, and it will be a modifier of the result called find array, and the name of the array is fields. Now that we've built our JSON array for the field list, let's step through it. We'll step through the collection of the field list. We'll tell each record in the field list to be called field. The first thing we want to do is find out what the field name is. So that is a new variable called field name. We're going to set that to the field with the string from element of name. And then we're going to compare to see if that string value of the name is in our spec schema. So we have a stored value that we built in our first one-step spec schema. We want to know, is that spec schema like the field name? And if it is, we want to know, is the value, so we have field, and the modifier on this one is called, because it's a text expression there, we have to tell it that it's as a JSON, and then the second modifier is string from element value. So we want to know, is the value not empty? So if it's part of the schema and the value is not empty, we're good to go. And in those cases, we will add that field name. And in this case, the modifier is going to be display name. What's the difference between display name and name? Well, the name will never have any spaces or dashes in it, but the display name might. And the display name is usually what you see on the form, whereas the name attribute is actually the internal name of the field. So we'll add that to our report variable, and then we'll add the value to the report vals. Same thing here. String from element, value. And then when we're all done, we can show that we have two columns here, report variable and report vals, this could be added to the email, or we could add it to the details of an approval, for example. So that's how it looks internally. Let's see how it works. So here we have a new employee request for Andrew Sims. And we're going to go ahead and run the one step. And since we're calling get specific values from get specific schemas, we only have to run the first one step. And there you have the report that would be added into either the email, or if you were using this to give more details in an approval, this could also be added to the approval details. Well, I hope you found that this video was informative. And if you like our videos from Beyond 20, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or visit us at www.beyond20.com for more information on how Beyond 20 can help you with all of your Cherwell service management and Cherwell asset management needs, as well as any training needs you may have with ITIL, DevOps, or other ITSM services.